It's 12:03 by my count, so why don't we get started? My name is Arnold Weinfeld, and I am Associate Director for the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research. Welcome, everyone, to our Public Policy Forum on the Election Wrap-Up. Very pleased today to have two panels with us, one featuring pollsters, Matt Grossmann, Steve Mitchell, and Bernie Porn, and a second with media and communications folks, Zach Gorchow, Darci McConnell, and Kyle Melinn. This presentation is being taped and can be seen in the coming days on our website, ipser.msu.edu, or you can join today's discussion on Twitter at #ElectionWrapUp. Before we get started, I'd also like to thank our sponsors and co-hosts for this event, the Michigan Political Leadership Program and co-directors Steve Tabachman and Susie Avery, as well as the Michigan Political History Society, President Dan Papanow and Vice President Roberta Stanley. Thank you very much for making this program possible. And with that, some notes for our attendees. All attendees are on mute. And if you have a question, please use the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen. And we will be taking questions at both panels for all the panelists. And with that, I think we'll get started. So we'll get started with our first panel featuring Bernie Porn. Bernie is founding principal and president of Epic MRA, and he draws on more than 3 decades of research and communication experience. His primary role with the firm involves the writing and analysis of survey research conducted for Epic MRA clients. Matt Grossmann. Dr. Grossmann is director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State University. He has written several books. His latest is Red State Blues, How the Conservative Resolution Stalled in the State. And he's also the co-author of Campaigns and Elections, a leading elections textbook. Matt Grossmann also serves as a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C., hosts the Science of Politics podcast, and is a regular contributor at 538. And our third panelist is Steve Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell Research and Communications Incorporated. He's worked in more than 40 states since 1985, and his political clients have included governors, U.S. senators, members of Congress, and state and local office holders as well. He founded his company after working on the national staff of President Ronald Reagan's successful run for president. He's been a consultant on pollster on hundreds of campaigns, as well as for media, both here in Michigan and across the country. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for being here with us. Bernie, why don't you get us started off with your perspective on the 2020 election?
I would be glad to, and I'm very happy to participate in the program. Thank you, Arnold. We finished our last poll on October 28th, about 5 days before the election. And our poll showed that there was a 7-point lead with Biden leading 48 to 41%. And in the U.S. Senate race, we had Peters up by 5 points, 47 to 42%. And I should also note that in the survey for president, we had 5% saying they were going to vote for a third-party candidate, with 6% saying they were undecided. And it was not until after the election results came in that I decided I should take a look at the results for the voters who said they were going to vote for a third-party candidate, because 5% is not representative of the 1% who actually voted for a third-party candidate. And so I looked at the responses of those 5%, and we got 5% in several polls, roughly. And I have come to the conclusion that there is a lie factor, and many of those folks who said they were going to vote for a third-party candidate, I think really voted for Donald Trump. And if you were to apply the 4% of the 5% that said they were going to vote for a third-party candidate and give them to Trump, he would be at 45%, and so it would have been 48 to 45. And then among the 6% who were undecided in our survey, I think we had assumed that they're going to be roughly equal in terms of how the undecideds broke. And I think that was probably the case, giving Biden the 51 to 48% win that he had in Michigan. And the same thing I think is true for the Peters-James race. They had 2% who actually voted for third-party candidates, and we had 5%. And so if you would apply the 3% of the third-party candidate votes for James, it would be a 47 to 45%. Breaking the undecideds would give you the 50 to 48% lead and win that Peters had over James. And in looking at the results and evaluating the responses of those third-party voters in responses to other questions, they were very contradictory, which gave me the impression pretty clearly that they were messing with us. And so I used to dismiss the notion of a lie factor and shy Trump voters, but I think in Michigan, indeed, that is the case. Trump won 73 of the 83 counties, and of the 10 counties that Biden won, he increased his vote over what Clinton got in many of those counties significantly. And it should also be noted that Trump increased his vote in most counties above what he got in 2016, significantly so. As a matter of fact, a poll by Democracy Corps indicated that about 14% of rural voters increased over 2016 for Trump. And I think that is very evident in the results. There are 12 counties where Biden got more votes than he got in 2000, or than Clinton got in 2016, than in comparison to what Trump got. So 12 counties, including Ottawa County, a significantly higher number of voters went for Biden than went for Clinton. There was an increase for Trump over his 2016 numbers. However, Biden still lost Ottawa County, as one would expect. In the key counties that Trump did win, Kent County, Biden won by 52%. Clinton got 45% in 2016. Trump got 17,000 more votes than he got in 2016, where Biden got 48,000 more votes. Other ones, Ingham County, 5 points higher for Biden than for Clinton, and Trump got 3,800 more votes than he got in 2016, while Biden got 15,000 more. Kalamazoo County, that was a big gainer for Biden. He got 16,000 more votes than Clinton got, while Trump got 5,800 more votes. And Oakland County, Trump got 37,000 more votes than he did in 2016, but Biden got 91,000 more votes and won with 57% compared to the 51.6% for Clinton. So there was higher turnout for both candidates, and clearly there was a significant increase among rural voters, but also there were, according to Democracy Corps polling, that was a 2,000 sample poll that was taken on election day and compared to a survey prior to the election. That showed that 7%, there was a 7% increase in new white working class voters. And I think that turned things significantly for Trump, making it much closer. Also, the impact on the election with Black Lives Matter getting, I think, tremendous support nationally after the George Floyd death. Many people fairly solid support for Black Lives Matter. That was the case, I think, in Michigan as well. However, we tested twice that organization. And in the first test, it was 50 to 42%. And at this time, the Black Lives Matter group had already started associating itself with the defund the police. And the impact on that was that folks who were very supportive of Black Lives Matter were all of a sudden against it. And that poll, the 50 to 42% support for Black Lives Matter, it was overwhelmingly supported by Democrats and equally split among independent voters, while Republicans overwhelmingly opposed it. 57% in our poll said that they disapproved of defunding the police. And that was even after we told them that it would not eliminate police departments. So that was something that the Trump campaign and Donald Trump kind of latched onto. And that whole issue had a profound impact on the election, especially among seniors. Seniors went from supporting Joe Biden because of his promise to protect Social Security and Medicare, and also to deal with the coronavirus, to supporting Trump because of law and order and viewing Democrats as being too willing to be permissive with the demonstrations. So that, I think, had a profound impact. And when you look at the support that Biden got, he got his support from Black voters, millennials, unmarried women, college-educated women, and 93% of Black voters, 71% of millennials, 66% of unmarried women, 64% of college-educated women, 62% of millennials, 57% of Hispanics, 57% of white unmarried women, 55% of white millennials, and 43% of seniors. Much lower than what pre-polling had showed. 42% of white working class women, and only 33% of rural voters and 30% of working class men. That's the level of support that Biden ended up with in the polling from Democracy Corps. And so that, I think, is what happened. The polling, I had wished that it would have been a little bit more accurately reflected what Donald Trump was getting. But when I look at the third party reaction, I think that that is probably a big explanation for what transpired in terms of a potential lie factor. Now, Donald Trump, if he is on the ballot in 2024, as he suggests, I can guarantee you that I will have included questions that will try to identify whether or not and the extent to which there is a lie factor. But right. I think it's entirely possible that that will not be the case, and he may be otherwise occupied at the time.
Bernie, we've got a couple of questions that I'd like to turn to before we turn to our other panelists. Remember, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. We have over 170 participants today, 170 attendees. So we'll be using the Q&A box. Regarding this lie factor you keep talking about, how did that play out regionally? Did you look at that? Was it equally prevalent across regions across the state? Or, I mean, that's, you know, did we see this quote lie factor come into play?
The 5% was actually higher in a few areas. I can't remember all of them, but I did look at the geographical breakdown. And it was significantly higher in a few areas. And so obviously the potential, and in those areas, the percentage voting for a third party candidate was only like 2%. And so clearly that was, I think, something that transpired statewide.
And one other question before we move on. How did you define, or what was your definition of working class status in your polls when you say, when you have that category?
They were responding, I think, and I did not see the survey from Democracy Corps, and so this is all out of their survey, but I believe they asked questions about if you're currently working, and they have questions that define what they consider working class respondents. And that's a standard question that Stan Greenberg includes in his polls. And he denoted those who are white working class voters and noted that there was a lot of new voters. Now, we did a check on our database, and there were 181,000 new registrants between July and the election from the QVF file. And it was very strong in terms of new registrants outstate, as well as in Southeast Michigan. I think that those new registrants were voters for Trump in many respects. And Biden was able to win because he increased above Clinton's vote by more in those key counties, those 10 counties, as well as a few others than what Clinton got. And even though Trump increased his numbers as well.
Thanks, Bernie. A lot of information there. And I just want to remind our attendees that you'll be able to view this through our website after the broadcast is over. If you'd like to go back and try and slow down that fire hose of statistics that Bernie just threw at us. So let's go next to Matt Grossmann. Matt?
All right, everybody see my screen?
Yeah, we got it.
So we asked in both 2016 and 2020 surveys of the Michigan public and the policy insider community around Lansing who they thought was going to win Michigan. And you can see that we were all surprised in 2016. That says Biden, but this was, of course, Clinton in 2016. The insiders were sort of just as confident this year that Biden was going to win. The public, a little less so. Republicans in the public, probably because of last time, were more likely to expect Trump to win than they were last time. But you can see that expectations were still pretty strong for Biden in Michigan. This is a visualization of, it's not showing up very well, but a little bit of what Bernie was talking about, the swing in the county vote from 2016 to 2020. Basically the suburban areas around Detroit, West Michigan, and the area up here around Traverse City were the areas that swung towards Biden from Clinton last time. So these aren't the strongest areas for Biden. These are just the changes from 2016 to 2020. There were some areas that swung a bit toward Trump, but not much. You basically saw Trump getting similar margins in rural areas and Biden gaining in parts of the state. I think this pattern was roughly expected, though the polls were showing more movement kind of statewide than we ended up seeing. And that was mirrored a little bit in down ballot. This is the state house results. Not much change. I think one characterization might be that voters who voted Trump, but for Democrats down ballot in 2016, were more likely to vote Republican across the board this time, especially in rural areas. And that wasn't true of sort of the new Biden voters. Some of the new Biden voters, as in West Michigan, did not necessarily vote Democrat across the board. Some of them kept voting for Republicans. So that's how you get kind of that combination of maps, Democrats gaining in the presidential vote, but not necessarily that translating into down ballot gains. This is a depiction of the polling error across time. You can see that our polling error was relatively large in 2020, just as it was in 2016. This is the Dem margin, difference between the Democrats' margin versus the average of public opinion polls pre-election. But we aren't alone. Again, a lot of the same places had the same error in the same direction, places like Ohio, Iowa, where there are a lot of white voters without a college degree that saw similar polling errors this time and last time. Now, that doesn't mean that it's intrinsic to Michigan, though. You can see that, you know, in 2008 and 2012, Michigan polls actually slightly underestimated Obama rather than Romney or McCain. So it isn't sort of always true across time, but it is troubling that the same pattern of polling errors was present in 2016, actually in 2018 as well, and 2020 across these states. So there does appear to be something systematic, and we do seem to have pinpointed it to have something to do with white voters without a college degree. The white voters with college degrees did sort of move as expected based on the geographic evidence. But even though we were expecting the education divide to increase, it increased more than it looked like it would from the pre-election polls. One thing that everyone was expecting to matter a lot was increased turnout. We certainly did have big increases in turnout nationwide and in Michigan. This is from a pre-election analysis that was done by the New York Times, though, that I think is useful to highlight. Democrats tend to believe that they're going to gain no matter what from increased turnout, that they have the sort of low propensity voters. But that really isn't that true in the Midwest. It is true in the Sun Belt, especially in Arizona. It's true that the low propensity voters were more likely to be Democrats, but it isn't as true in the Midwest. So Trump brought out a lot more voters. He brought out some voters for him. He brought out some voters against him. But it wasn't clear that the increased turnout was a net positive for one party or the other in Michigan. It does seem to have been a net positive for Democrats in some states in the South, however. So this is the overall pattern across Midwest counties by college education. So higher is more voters with college degrees. The orange is Biden. The blue is Hillary Clinton margins. And so this is what I was saying here. There really wasn't much improvement for lower education areas for Biden over Clinton. It's pretty much the same. The improvement was in these high education areas and what you might call the middle of the pack a little bit, where a decent number of voters in those counties had college degrees. And if you look at the precinct analysis, it looks pretty similar, that white voters with college degrees were the biggest areas of gains for Democrats. And if there was a polling miss, or there was a polling miss, and it seems to be more likely to be concentrated down here. Now, there was an even bigger surprise down ballot than in the presidential race. Polls were off by more in House races and state legislative races. And this is a long-term perspective on how many seats the Democrats have in the U.S. House and how they did in the national House vote if you add up all of the votes for U.S. House of Representatives. And so you can see that they're normally, pretty close. There is a Republican advantage that we talk about a lot, but the Republicans also don't always do poorly in the national House vote. They won the national House vote in several years, in 2010 and 2004. They actually also won it in 2016. In fact, Donald Trump actually underperformed Republican House candidates in the margins in both 2016 and 2020 by 3 points. So Trump brought out a lot more voters, but it isn't the case that he sort of overperformed generic Republicans. In fact, they did a little bit better in both years that he was on the ballot. One thing that's surprising, though, is that the winner of the presidential election typically gains seats in the House and gains margin. Democrats, of course, were going from a high point in 2018, but the same was true in 2006 when they had done very well. And you can see they increased their margins and seats in 2008. This will probably be the largest drop in House vote share for the winning presidential party that we have on record. So usually the winning presidential party does not lose a vote in the national House vote the way that Democrats did this time. There seem to be some voters who voted for Democrats in down ballot in order to vote against Trump in 2018, but did not necessarily carry that forward to 2020. Now, of course, most people who voted for Republicans voted for Republicans down the line, and vice versa for Democrats. But it is useful to look at some of the differences. So this is just a map of where Trump did better, the red areas, and where John James did better, the blue areas. And this is sort of the pattern that I was talking about. In these areas that were kind of moving towards the Democrats, John James did better than Donald Trump in the margin. Trump did better than John James in these rural areas. Obviously, they ended up very close to each other, but it does look like the overall pattern of the votes that went, new votes that went to Biden did not necessarily translate into less Republican voting overall. Biden versus Slotkin was a fun race to look at because it was not sort of expected to be the closest of the U.S. House races. Everybody had sort of moved over to West Michigan, but it turned out that Biden still lost this district, and so Slotkin really had to overperform Biden. Not many Democratic House candidates overperformed Biden, so this really is something of a change, and you can see that she did that substantially in throughout the rural parts of this area, overperforming Biden in those areas. So this is, again, this is just comparing the Biden vote and the Slotkin vote. Biden did better in the green areas, Slotkin did better in the pink areas when we're talking about margin here. So overall, this was the opposite pattern of nationally. Overall, Biden outperformed House candidates, but there were some districts where Democrats were able to develop independent reputations, and Alyssa Slotkin was one of them. We also asked people what they like and dislike about the parties in open-ended questions. And there was a lot of continuity here. These are the likes in each party. So this is what Republicans like about their own party. This is what Democrats like about their own party. You can see Trump is up here, but I think it's a little overstated to say this was just people brought out for Trump. In fact, this is pretty similar to what people normally say. Republicans normally say they're voting for conservatism, they're voting for values, they're voting for they're voting for small government, and they did that again this year. Democrats usually say they're voting for candidates that care about people, that want to help people, that are for the middle class, that are for minorities, and they said similar things this year. One thing that was different is favorability of the candidates. Obviously, we know 2016, both candidates were disliked. These were the most disliked candidates we've had on record. And that wasn't true this year. Donald Trump was more liked, and Joe Biden was a lot more liked than Hillary Clinton. And so we did see a similar pattern where voters that disliked both candidates might have decided to go with Trump in the end. But Biden had a lot more of sort of room to lose voters there than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Great information. And again, that PowerPoint will be available as well as this presentation. One question we have for you, what's the reason for those vote deltas in the under and over performance? Are they mostly due to ticket splitting, or is it undervoting? Do we know why that occurred?
We don't know completely. We do know that nationally, the polls did seem to underestimate ticket splitting. That is, they didn't necessarily find these variations between the U.S. House vote, the state legislative vote, and the presidential vote as much as we did see. But of course, some of it is undervoting. Some people just voting for Biden and then not voting in the other races, and the opposite, voting for Trump. So we don't know yet what those reasons are. One thing that we do know is that obviously a lot of people do use the straight ticket option, but once you take those people out, there was actually a lot of precinct level big differences between the vote in Trump and James among those people who did not vote straight tickets. So it could have been that the straight ticket option made it a little bit less common in Michigan than it was elsewhere.
Thank you, Matt. Now let's turn to Steve Mitchell. Steve brings unique perspective as someone who has worked campaigns for many years and done polling. So Steve, what's your take on all this?
Well, thanks very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here today. Appreciate the invitation. As you look at the 2020 race, Donald Trump lost it. Joe Biden didn't win it, Trump lost it. First of all, I think if we did not have a coronavirus, Trump would have won by a landslide, both in the electoral vote and the popular vote, certainly in the electoral vote. The coronavirus was the big problem for him. And as you take a look at what happened in this campaign, in my opinion, had Trump had a good first debate, he would have won. Had the second debate been October 15th instead of October 22nd, I still think he would have won. There's enough votes around the country that would allow him to win. But with the huge number of mail votes coming in this year as opposed to other years, too many votes were cast before he was able to perform, at least in a decent manner, in the second debate. He lost the first debate. He acted the way many people perceive him to act all the time. And as a result of that, a lot of the votes that came in after that were going to be against him. So this is a campaign that Donald Trump lost. It was a winnable campaign, even with the coronavirus and even with all the other issues that you have. And I want to address also this issue of the shy Trump voter that we've heard about. Much of the polling I do, which it really is a good way to do it because it limits the cost on it, is we'll do IVR or automated phoning to voters above the age of 45, and we'll text message to cell phones voters under 45. And as we did that in legislative districts all over the state, I think it probably polled in 20 at least legislative districts as well as the statewide polling. There was one thing we continuously saw in every poll, and that is every poll came in with an incredibly strong Democratic margin in terms of party affiliation. Although, because when you're doing automated polling and text messaging, you get a disproportionate number of voters who are women, and you get a disproportionate number of older voters. So a lot of waiting has to be done to bring those into line with what the electorate will look like. And I'll do that in Excel rather than doing it and letting the computer weight it. The last thing I look at, and the one thing I will let the computer do, is weight by party affiliation. As we looked at the raw data time after time, we kept seeing these samples coming in plus 12%, plus 15% Democratic. Now, normally I would weight those at about plus 3 or plus 4% Democratic. I thought because there were so many Democrats voting that this was going to be a huge Democratic year. And so I was conservative in the weighting. And rather than weighting it at 3 or 4%, I was weighting it at 5 or 6%. I took a look at the last survey I did, which was it was actually identical with Bernie's. Our numbers were different, but I had Biden up 7 and I had Peters up by 5. When I just put it in the computer and changed the weighting on party affiliation in a manner that would represent what I thought a normal voter turnout would be, which would be about plus 3.5%, then the final numbers I had in the poll, didn't release it, so can't take any credit for it, but it was a good educational step for me. The final numbers would have been Trump plus 4 and Peters plus 2.5. Again, when I weighted it. So if the shy Trump voter was there, absolutely. They just simply weren't responding to IVR polls or to text messaging. What I know in the future is I'll do all the same work, but 2 years from now and 4 years from now, I'm going to weight it at about plus 3%, which it normally should be a plus 3% Democratic sample. And I think we'll see the results come in. This was an interesting race because not only was it not plus 5% for Democrats, actually, according to the CNN exit polls, it was a 1% more Republican turnout than we saw 4 years ago when it was a more Democratic sample back in 2016. As a matter of fact, in 2016, it was a plus 9% Democratic sample, 41% to 30%. So in terms of the election results, we were, just as Bernie was, a little outside the margin of error at 4% greater than the final numbers were. We can do better, should do better, and let's take another shot at it 2 years from now. I do believe that this is going to be a rerun in 2024 of the 2020 election. I think Trump will run for re-election again. I can't imagine that he wouldn't. And I saw right after the election that Mick Mulvaney said he was going to as well. Take a look at what happened in this race. There was a much different turnout than there was back 4 years ago. Young people, for instance, this time only represented 13% of the total vote, as opposed to 21% last time. And Biden won by only 15%, as opposed to the 23% margin that Hillary Clinton won by with that same group of voters in 2016. You look at the 30 to 44-year-olds. This is a group that Trump won both in 2020 as well as in 2016. He won it by a little wider margin, 6 points instead of 4 points this time. So a big improvement. Where Trump lost the race was with older voters, those voters 45 to 64. He lost by a point this time. He won that group by 8 points last time. In seniors, he lost by 8% this time. He won that same group by 4% last time. As you look at gender, everybody talking about gender. Last time, the gender was just about even. Trump won men by 12 points, and he won. He lost women by 11 points. This time, Trump won the men by 11 points, but the women weighed in this time, and he lost women by 15%. And the women represented 54% of the vote this time, as opposed to 52% last time. So women are a huge key. One thing we kept seeing Trump do throughout the campaign was to try to encourage black votes and try to get more black votes. Those of us who've been around politics have always felt this is sort of a dream that Republicans have that never comes to fruition. As a matter of fact, the exit poll data shows that Trump was successful in attracting more African-American voters. Back in 2016, he lost 92 to 6, so he only got 6% of the vote. He got 50% more of the vote this time from African-Americans. He got 9% of the African-American vote. He got 12% of the African-American men. So that message with Kanye West, with the prison reform that he did, all those things caused an increase in African-American voters, which was really very important in him staying as close as he could in part of this game. So as you look at the statistics on this race, again, as you look at the differences in the voter turnout, again, we've seen here a much lower voter turnout among younger voters, a higher turnout, 7% higher among those 65-year-olds, a higher voter turnout about women, and women voted in a much greater portion for him. And when you look at the racial makeup, 80% of the voters this time were white, as opposed to only 75% last time. 15% were African-American last time, only 10% this time. So it's those white voters that the other two panelists were talking about that were key to keeping Trump into the game. This was a two-issue race. Back in 2004, one of the things that we saw was that the voters were concerned about either the economy if they were Democrats, or national defense if they were Republicans. And Bush was winning with the national defense folks by about 80-20, and Trump was winning with the, John Kerry was winning with the economy people by an equal margin. We saw the same thing this time. When the voters were asked what's the most important issue containing the coronavirus or the economy, 51% said it was the coronavirus, and among those voters, 83-16, Biden was winning. Among those who said the economy, 44% of the voters, by an 87-12 margin, Trump was winning. One of the things that was mentioned earlier was the Black Lives Movement. In my opinion, the death of Floyd ultimately hurt Democrats. And some of the Democrats in the House have said that. The defund police movement that came out of that, the riots in the street, all, I think, benefited Donald Trump. Among those who cited law and order in the campaign, 9% of the voters, by a 77 to 22 margin, they were voting for Donald Trump. As we look at the top issue, and this is where I'll wrap up today, 40% said it was the economy. Trump won 86 to 13 with those folks. 18% said the coronavirus. Biden won 94 to 5 with those voters. Among those who said that it was the inequality issue, 91 to 7, Biden won that group. And among those who said health care, about 10% of the voters, it was 80 to 6. So issues were important. At the end of the day, however, this was a race that Donald Trump would have won had he had a much better performance in the first debate. Too many people waited for that first debate, saw the first debate, saw the Donald Trump they thought that they knew about, and started casting their votes. And at the end of the day, Joe Biden is the president-elect and will serve for the next 4 years, and then has to stave off the challenge from a 78-year-old Donald Trump in 2024.
Steve, thank you very much, and thanks to all three of you. Several questions coming through in the Q&A, but many of them have to do, as you can imagine, with polling, how the confidence in polling moving forward, and what steps might be taken in the future in order to regain the public's confidence in polling. You know, Matt had talked about, and you all have talked about, the weighted differences, some for those with college education and those without. But what steps do you see pollsters and such as yourselves and others taking to try and ensure a little bit more accurate data moving forward? I'll leave that open to anyone.
I told you what I'm going to do. I know what I'm going to do now. I will presume that we have a divided electorate in any campaign. And no matter how democratic the samples come in, I'm going to weight them back up to about 3%. And I think that will assure accuracy. I actually, as I look back on it right now and look the way I did it, I made one fundamental error. As a result of the samples coming in so democratic, I weighted it differently than I normally would have. It was a mistake, and it cost me being more accurate. So I feel very good about what I did this time. And in 2022 and 2024, I think we'll be a lot more accurate.
Matt, Bernie, any comment on that about what steps you might take moving forward?
Well, as I had mentioned before, if in fact Donald Trump is on the ballot again to try and address the potential lie factor, I will ask follow-up questions to try and flesh out any third-party candidates or those who are undecided a little bit more than what we have done thus far. And in terms of the sample itself, I think the sampling that we do is pretty accurate. And when Donald Trump is not on the ballot, I think we've been pretty accurate, and I think many pollsters have been. So if in fact he's on the ballot, well, I'll try to address that. If he's not, well, then I would expect that the polling would be, by all pollsters, will be much more accurate.
And Matt, I asked this of you. You've been in this business quite a while yourself. A couple of articles I read mentioned AI as a possibility to be included in polling moving forward. A couple of apparently polls that used AI were pretty close in calling, especially the national election. Any readings that you've seen, any discussions amongst your colleagues in academia, especially about the use of AI in polling?
I don't think that it's likely to make that much difference if the problems are sampling. I guess I'm not necessarily in full agreement with Bernie. I think that the national evidence is pretty clear that however we ask the questions, they really don't show much of a shy, and certainly not a Trump-specific shy voters. We underestimated Republicans across the board. And so that, to me, suggests much more likely sort of what Steve was talking about, an undersampling of Republicans or maybe an overwillingness of Democrats to respond to surveys. But I would say that the problem in the online surveys that do that pretty regularly has been that swing voters might be missing too. So you can upweight the party, but it's going to be hard to find those voters who, for example, were willing to vote for Biden but still supported their Republican House candidates and state legislative candidates. If those folks are just less likely to respond to surveys in any form, it's very hard to correct that after the fact.
And one other question, with so many people turning to mail-in ballots, what is the use of exit polls except for the media? Do exit polls actually mean anything anymore?
Certainly, polling outside of the polling place is limited, and I think that the way we used to do our exit polls, making phone calls with a very large sample, would probably be more accurate than the way they have been done by the networks over the past few years. And I think that that way you can ask if they have already voted and how they voted. And it is important to note that among those that voted by absentee ballot, and we had 54% in our poll saying that they would vote by absentee ballot. And when you look at the 3.1 who ended up voting by absentee ballot, that's about 55% of the total turnout out of the 5.6 million. And among those who did vote by absentee ballot, 66% were voting for Biden. Among those that primarily said they would vote by going to the poll on election day, those are by about the same percentage saying that they would vote for Donald Trump. And so hence, Trump's strategy of trying to delegitimize mail-in voting, and even to the extent that maybe Mr. DeJoy tried to slow things up with the post office, that could have an impact on minimizing Democratic votes. So moving forward, I would be surprised if Republicans do not try to use mail-in voters as they have in the past. Usually in past elections, Republicans have won among absentee balloting. And I think only because of the greater fear among Democrats about the coronavirus do you have the unbalanced response in terms of voting style now compared to the past.
In terms of the exit polls, they do have a component, and they've done this for a number of years, of phoning absentee ballots. And so that was a part of the methodology this time as well from the networks. They use a combination of exit polls at the polls as well as phoning. And they've been doing that for several years. So that has been a factor throughout that, just to clarify that point.
But historically, the exit polls have been more off when it comes to overstating the education level of the electorate. So it's not clear that either one. We had two basically this time. The one the AP and Fox used, which caused them to call Arizona rather early, and the one that the rest of the networks use. I don't see any evidence that they're getting any better at identifying the composition of the electorate over time.
That's right. I agree with that. I think as we'll keep progressing on polling, my response is to everybody that wants to criticize, go ahead and try it, see how you can do. We all do the best job we can. And sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we don't get it right. So it's just one of those things. We all just do the best job that we can, and we will continue to do it. We'll continue to try to figure it out, because this is a business that's gotten far more difficult over the years than easier.
Keep in mind, 95% confidence level, that means that 1 out of 20 is going to be outside and sometimes really messed up.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you all for the work that you do, for taking time here today to be with us, and I appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now we'll turn to our second panel. Our second panel of folks from the media and communications. With us today, we have Darci McConnell, President and CEO of McConnell Communications, With more than 20 years of experience in communication strategy, crisis management, media relations, and leadership building, Darci spent 14 years as a reporter for newspaper outlets across the state, as well as Washington, D.C. Zach Gorchow, executive editor and publisher of Gongwer News Services. He manages Gongwer's Michigan operations and has been editor at Gongwer from 2009 to 2019. He also covered the Michigan House of Representatives for Gongwer from 1998 to 2005. And our third panelist in this segment is Kyle Melinn, editor and vice president of MERS News. He's been a professional journalist for 20 years and has covered the state capitol for the last 13. He's a regular on Off the Record, The Big Show with Michael Patrick Shields, and radio shows across the state. He also hosts a weekly podcast from MERS every Monday. Thanks to the three of you for being with us. And I think much like we did in the beginning, we will start in alphabetical order by first name. So Zach, that means you're gonna go last this time. I bet you weren't thinking of that one, huh? So Darci, if you'd like to start us off with your perspective on the 2020 election, it'd be greatly appreciated. And you're muted currently, Darci, so thank
Sorry
you.
about that. So sure, thanks for having me. So I just have some, I guess, quick takeaways. One is an anecdotal one that I've been saying since 2016, and that is, as soon as Trump won, he motivated parts of the base that either sat out, because again, there's sort of this illusion that Black folks cost Hillary Clinton the race in the previous election. So really, as we've heard from the pollsters and as we've seen, she was lower on all parts of the base, right? So people have been motivated, particularly women, particularly African-Americans, since 2016. The other thing that happened that hasn't happened, as far as I can tell, is a number of groups that previously hadn't participated in voter mobilization efforts got engaged. So of course, you had Indivisible. Those are the former Obama folks, but you also had groups like the ACLU. If you look at what happened in other states, so sort of like in Georgia, they were sort of new grassroots organizations that got involved in helping to both engage likely voters, but also to go after new registrants and unlikely voters. So the way that played out in Detroit, for example, you had groups like Good Jobs Now. And then another factor that also happened is they had funding. The party also did a better job this time in starting early. Historically, the Democratic Party has not made an effort to engage African-American voters until after Labor Day. This time they started before the August primary. And so that was significant as well. So I've been saying consistently that the base has been motivated since 2016, and that was, as well as these other groups that work to engage voters, and that was going to be a factor in this election. So some may say, well, yeah, but Biden didn't do as well as Hillary, but you have to remember, one, that Obama's numbers are like an anomaly. I don't know if and when we'll get back to those levels of turnout for the base. But beyond that, you also have to think about the shifting population. So even if Biden didn't do as well as Clinton in Detroit, Wayne County was up, Oakland County was up, and remember, the population has shifted. So the other thing that I wanted to mention that no one seems to be talking about is I think it's unparalleled the amount of money that was spent by the so-called Blacks for Trump, the GOP, that made an aggressive courting of Blacks, but I say it was designed to suppress as much as it was to get people to vote for Trump. I think the hope was, and I think there was some success with this, was to make Biden appear just as bad as Trump. And they had some pretty powerful commercials to that effect, particularly as it relates to the crime bill. And so I think there was, and finally, let's not forget, all the suppression tactics, literally calling voters in Flint and saying, stay home today, the lines will be too long, show up tomorrow, the day after the election. The robocalls that went into people's houses, the so-called monitoring that was going to take place at the poll. So all of these things, to me, led to either some bleed off or the increase that Trump saw, or maybe the numbers not being as high as people expected. I actually did canvassing the weekend before the election. And I went to a voter's door. I think the individual may have been in his 70s. And he said, "Oh yeah, I already voted." And I said, "Well, I hope you supported Biden." He said, "Oh no, I didn't vote for president. I didn't vote in the presidential." So to me, that's like exhibit Q of the sort of residual effect of this really intense spending on cable and radio to try and, not, like I said, not necessarily get people to support Trump, but to make no distinction between Trump and Biden and maybe suppress the vote. So that's sort of my overall take, particularly as it relates to voters of color.
Interesting perspective. Thank you, Darci, very much for that. One question we did have that is related to the Black vote. So despite the efforts that you just talked about, do you feel that this year's election might change the view of the value of the Black vote and that it's more powerful than was thought previously?
Well, I think it changed to the extent that more efforts were made earlier to court African-American voters, right? Again, and whether that means advertising, whether that means organizing. So I think that has already changed. If you think about where Biden was, about to drop out of the race, and then African-Americans certainly helped him in South Carolina. So I think that perspective has already started to change. Now, will it be sustained? I certainly hope so.
Yeah, we forget so quickly about the turnaround that South Carolina provided for him, and that was all because of the African-American vote. Absolutely. Great point, Darci. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Stick around and we'll have more questions later on. Kyle, you're up next.
All right. Well, thank you, Arnold. Well, I had three big takeaways with this particular election. The first one was the huge amount of turnout that we saw. And I know others have referenced this, but let's just think of this from an historical perspective. 5.5 million people showed up to vote, which is more than we've ever had in this state. And if you think of it from a percentage standpoint, percentage-wise, that's about 70 to 71% of the voting age population in the state of Michigan. For 70 to 71%, we haven't seen anything like that since 1960 with the Kennedy-Nixon election had a little more turnout, but we hadn't seen anything like that. It was more than Obama in 2008, more than any other election. So I thought that was particularly striking. And I think some of it was the interest in Trump, as some of the other speakers have said, but I think also the COVID-19 crisis brought politics into people's lives more than they are used to having. They had to deal with an issue that they've never dealt with before, a global pandemic, and they've had to adjust their lives. And so they were more dialed into I think the political speech and the people talking about it than they would have normally. All of the distractions, all the other entertainment that we're always used to, whether it's sports or going out to a concert or a play or a movie, all off the table, unless you wanted to do it at home and watch all old sporting events until about July. You couldn't help but be engaged in politics. And so I think that had a significant impact. And then as a result, it changed how people campaigned. It changed how it changed the conversation more to healthcare than it had been before, which helps Democrats a little bit. And then another takeaway, the other second big takeaway is that it's a divided state. It's a divided country. It's a divided state. The Democrats can't really say that it was a complete victory for them because as was stated earlier by Matt Grossmann, Alyssa Slotkin, their big shining star, darn near lost her congressional race. It wasn't that big a blowout at all. And if you look at state house races, Republicans kept 58 to 52 majority, but they could have lost 1, 2, 3 house races I'm thinking of right off the top of my head. That was only a couple percentage points. So it is a divided state. You're seeing it on kind of the urban, suburban, and rural basis. You're seeing it on education level. And this election really showed it. The third highlight that I'll just touch on is the amount of money. Darci mentioned that was spent on trying to get African Americans out to vote. I'll just say on the U.S. Senate race in general, the first $100 million race in the state of Michigan happened, and that was the Gary Peters and John James race. Just an amazing, massive total that was spent here because control of the Senate was in play, and the Democrats realized that Gary Peters was really their only vulnerable incumbent, and so they were going to defend him come hell or high water. And the Republicans saw this as really their only pickup opportunity, so they were going to keep Dems on their heels. So with all the outside spending, with basically John James turning his entire campaign into fundraising and doing very little else, they just raised an enormous amount of money. I just don't know how else. I just don't know what circumstances will result in having anything that what we saw here with the amount of spending in that U.S. Senate race.
Thanks, Kyle, for that perspective. And again, we'll get to some questions after we hear from Zach Gorchow. Zach?
Good afternoon. It's great to be with all of you. So a few takeaways I had. Kyle talked about the turnout, and this is something I think that's been discussed nationally. You know, in the past and recent past, one would have said, if you were going to have this type of turnout, the Democrats would be winning everything. How many times we heard the Democrats say, when we vote, we win, which kind of goes back to the sort of 1992 to 2014 model, where in the presidential years, when the Democratic voters would show up, they won, they tended to win top to bottom of the ticket. But then for the most part, in the midterms, when they didn't show up, it generally went much better for the Republicans. Here we had over 5.5 million voters, record turnout, and it's kind of thrown out this idea that huge turnout inherently favors the Democrats. I think it nominally favored them in Michigan. I think it helped them win a Supreme Court seat, and certainly helped Joe Biden win. But we didn't see it go top to bottom of the ticket. And, you know, their presidential and U.S. Senate candidates really had to hang on by their fingernails. There were a lot of new Republican voters that the Republican Party identified and got out to vote, or were motivated to go out and vote by President Trump. And so it's going to be really interesting to see, is this a Trump era anomaly, or do things go back to the way they were in future elections? You know, we're seeing more, you know, voters that tend to have bachelor's degrees are shifting to the Democratic Party. Those tend to be the voters who show up the most often. Working class voters that Democrats have relied on in the past, who tend to be less reliable voters, are moving to the Republican Party. So we could be seeing a major realignment in assumptions about what turnout means. We just don't know yet. I thought ticket splitting was a bigger factor than certainly I expected and others expected this time around. You really see it in some of these state house races. You know, I thought the Democrats were going to pick up all 3 Oakland County state house seats that were really being hard fought. They ended up only getting 1, and the reason was ticket splitting. Joe Biden carried all 3 of those House districts, but there was a major fall off in the Democratic vote as people got down to state House. As I recall, hopefully I'm not going to botch these numbers, but as I recall, in Commerce Township, which was in the state representative Ryan Berman district, you had Trump, Berman, Erica Shockey, sort of the whole Republican ticket there, all getting about 15,000 votes out of Commerce Township. You know, Joe Biden lost Commerce. It's a very Republican community, but he got 12,000 votes. But then as you go down the ticket, Haley Stevens was down at like 11,000, and Julia Pulver, this Democrat state House candidate, was down at 10,000. So it appeared there was a number of people who were plunking for Biden for president, maybe Republican leaning voters, couldn't stomach Trump, but then came right back to the Republican side. And it really cost the Democrats dearly in these two key districts. So that I thought was very interesting. And then I think, I wrote about this the other day, sort of the explosion of the Democratic strength and what I call the retail corridor of Oakland and Wayne counties, communities like Troy, Novi, Canton Township, Farmington Hills, Northville Township, Royal Oak, Birmingham. I might be forgetting somebody in there, but these communities, Joe Biden improved so dramatically over Hillary Clinton's performance in these communities 4 years ago. So Joe Biden won Oakland and Macomb counties by 92,608 votes more than Hillary Clinton did this time. And of that amount, almost 50,000 came from 14 communities that sort of fit this description that I just mentioned. That means that if you think of Biden's overall margin in the state, which is almost 150,000 votes, a third of that came from him improving over Clinton's performance in just these 14 cities and townships. I'll just name one real quickly here. So Troy, 5,000 vote improvement in the margin. So in other words, Biden beat Trump by 5,000 more votes than Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. That is hopefully I don't mess up the number here, 1,600% increase in the margin. I mean, this is, a major dynamic kinds of things happening there. There's a variety of reasons for it. You've got the large percentage of people with bachelor's degrees. These are rapidly, increasingly diversifying communities, particularly with people of South Asian descent. Troy, Novi in particular have large populations of South Asian descent. I mentioned Canton. So I think that is going to be, what's going to be interesting is, does that continue to spread outward in Oakland County? Does it reach out to places like Commerce Township? Does it get farther into West Bloomfield? Rochester Hills, which went for Biden, but went for the Republican state house candidate. And I believe it also went for John James. Does it reach farther out there? So I think that's going to be a real dynamic to watch.
Zach, I think that was a great article you wrote. I read that myself. You can call it a retail corridor, but I think as we dive into that, we will find that a lot of that swing has to do because of the education level. And I think Matt showed that in one of his slides as well. Those, I think there were, in my opinion, two areas where Joe Biden did much better than Hillary Clinton, and that is among African-American voters, voting in particular, as well as the big swing in those communities that have a higher education than others. So there's a lot of nuances to this election. And I'd actually, as we get into questions here in the last part, I'd actually like to bring back Matt and Steve to the panel as well. Bernie had to take off for another appointment. So let's get into some of these questions in particular. One I have is, did the passage of Proposal 3 in 2018 have any impact on Joe Biden and Gary Peters carrying Michigan? And of course, that was the voters, I can't remember what we called it back then, but certainly the voting rights proposal with mail-in and same-day registration. Any thoughts, folks, on whether or not Proposal 3 has had an impact in this state?
Well, I think the Democrats used it to their advantage. The fact that they were able to use no reason absentee voting, they took full advantage during this whole COVID crisis to let people know that you can cast your vote early and you don't have to give a reason. I don't know how they would have done it without Proposal 3. I guess we'll never know. But it certainly made getting votes out easier during this troubling time.
Anybody else want to comment on the impact of Prop 3? Darci?
No, I would agree that it certainly was helpful. No reason absentee for sure. Being able to automatically be registered at the time that you get your license, same day registration, at least it was used to, encourage people to participate, that it was going to be easier to participate. I mean, absentee voters have historically always been the most likely of voters. So that phenomenon is not new. The pandemic certainly made more people vote absentee. We saw that in the primary as well. But yeah, it's hard to, I would think that with young voters on an uptick, that certainly played a role.
Maybe this one's for our pollsters, Matt and Steve. Given the fact that we saw such a high voter turnout and have so much more data available, where do you see opportunities and challenges with all this data, especially in polling? Any thoughts from Matt or Steve?
Well, the high turnout was sort of successfully predicted by the polls, so I don't think that was quite a miss. It's possible that they underestimated Republican turnout more than Democratic turnout. I do think that the early voting made that challenging. You've got a survey where you have people saying they've already voted, and you're trying to weigh that against people who say they're certain to vote on election day, and so that could be a source of problems for polls. But I think the broader indication is just everyone always thinks that increasing turnout is going to be the way for their side to be successful, and they're quite associated. When you increase turnout on one side, you tend to increase turnout on the other side, and a lot of people don't. A lot of people think that the advantage of moderate candidates is that they win over swing voters, and that is one. But actually, the research shows that the bigger advantage is that they mobilize the opposition less than do more people who are more extreme on the ideological spectrum. So increasing turnout, of course, we spend a lot of time trying to do that, but it isn't usually where the election results come from.
What about the same day registration piece? Do we know if more people avail themselves of that mechanism as compared to the presidential primary? Have we seen any numbers yet?
I recall it was a relatively small number. I haven't seen a final number, but I think we're talking low 5 figures of people who took advantage of same day registration. So I don't know that it really, played a decisive role in any of these races, given the margins we're looking at. It doesn't, to the extent that people thought, wow, maybe you'll see 50 to 100,000 people register to vote same day and go and vote. That did not happen. That said, it was the first time for this. It's a new mechanism. Also, the COVID dynamic is probably a big disincentive for people to think I'm going to wait till election day to register to vote and go through the rigmarole of same day registration. So I don't think it's really been put to the test yet. Probably get a better indicator in 2 years.
If I could respond just a little bit about the voter turnout. I think what we really saw in this election was the ability of both sides to dramatically increase voter turnout. One of the criticisms of the Trump campaign had been continuously, they were not concentrating on trying to win over women voters, but rather they were trying to do a much better job of increasing the voter turnout among those groups that were likely to vote for them. And they clearly did that. I mean, they clearly were able to do it, as were the Democrats. One factor that nobody has discussed so far is the impact of third-party voting between this election and the last election. In fact, I did an extensive analysis of the 2016 election and concluded that unless there were strong third-party candidates, that Donald Trump could not win Michigan. And if you take a look at it, if you subtract from Joe Biden the number of third-party votes that were cast in 2016, actually Trump would have won again by a small margin. Most of those third-party votes, I think, in both 16 and 20, went to people who were not going to vote for the Democratic candidate in this case. And so I think that one of the reasons he won last time was those 275,000, 187,000 more votes for third-party candidates were cast 4 years ago than were cast this time. In terms of voter turnout, this was a direct result of the parties doing an incredible job, plus the unprecedented interest in the race. And I agree with the statement that was made earlier. This is a completely divided state, a completely divided country by about 3% more Democrat than Republican. And you're going to see this division down the road. And one final point, talking about those congressional races, I kept urging my old friend Mike Bishop to run for election again. Had he done so, he would have been back in Congress. No doubt he would have raised enough money, and with a profile having been a congressman in that district, that he would have knocked out Felissa Slotkin had he chose to run this time.
Well, let's talk about down the road. A couple of you have mentioned 2 years from now. In the interim, between now and then, we have a redistricting commission that will be working here in Michigan to redraw lines. What impact do you think that will have moving into the 2022 election cycle, when both it'll be a midterm election, of course, and the House and the Senate here in the state will be up, will be working under new lines. Do we see any real impact coming forward from a redistricting proposal from this commission?
I think it's inevitable that we're going to see some kind of fallout, because for the first time in the at least recent time, if not forever in Michigan, we're not going to have the politicians writing the lines to keep their own seats. I mean, that's been the whole deal with the current redistricting system that we've had. It's not necessarily gerrymander to save your political party, it's gerrymander to save yourself. And when the politicians aren't drawing their own districts to keep them away from other politicians, you're going to inevitably have people who are going to be drawn into the same district, and they're going to have to make decisions whether they want to pick up and move, or if they want to run for a different office, whether that's local or whether that's state. And I think it's inevitable that we're going to see somebody who we don't even know yet, because we're not going to see census data until next year in the spring. We just don't know who's going to get roped in with who. And at that point, I think we're going to see some very different decisions than what we're even considering right now.
So I think we're going to see a really dramatic situation with the U.S. House districts. We're going to go down from 14 districts to 13. You've got 4 members of Congress, all Democrats, who live in Oakland County right now. That is not sustainable. There are going to be people who are going to get drawn together, or, they're going to have to think about moving. I know you don't have to live in the district to run for the U.S. House, but it certainly is advisable, all things being equal. What happens to, Peter Meyer, Bill Huizenga, Fred Upton out in that corner of Michigan? Are there really going to be 3 districts that, are separate for each of them? That seems unlikely. I think it's going to be really interesting when it comes to the state house. You look at these results from earlier this month in the elections. I saw a lot of Democrats out there saying, really looking forward to, some nonpartisan, fair lines being drawn. They might be disappointed, might be overestimating the impact these are going to have. I mean, you take a look at a district right now, like Jim Hadsma. He's from Battle Creek. His district sort of is very gerrymandered in Calhoun County to sort of bring together the Democratic components of the county. He barely hung on against an opponent who basically slept through the whole election, didn't spend a dime, had no outside support. And he ended up winning, I think, by 1 percentage point because Calhoun County is becoming a Republican county. So what happens when the redistricting commission, which is supposed to now draw districts that are not all squiggly and weird looking, and they're supposed to get more compact and bring communities of interest together, makes that district more rational looking? It presumably loses Albion, which is a Democratic city, and becomes more Republican. I'd say Jim Hadsma might have a problem winning, or not to go on and on too long, but look at one of the Democrats' new state representatives, Christine Morse from Portage. Kalamazoo County has grown dramatically. Right now, it's got 2 full House districts and then 2 other districts that have pieces of the county. I'd expect the county is probably now going to have 3 full districts. And I would suspect that for Christine Morris, her district is going to bring in more Republican turf than it has now. Doesn't mean she's going to lose, but I think her task could get harder. I mean, I don't know this, but, you look at the numbers and the population growth, and, I know all the Democrats are upset about, Julia Pulver losing because the Republicans gerrymandered that West Bloomfield Commerce Township district to give the most Republican parts of West Bloomfield into that district. But, Commerce Township has to go somewhere. And, if you bring all of West Bloomfield back together, where does Mari Manoogian's district go? Does it get more Republican? There's not a lot of easy answers. And I think the idea, if Democrats have the idea that we're going to have this new commission, we're winning the House, end of story, I don't think it's going to be that simple.
And geographic concentration got worse for Democrats in this election. So if on a redistricting map, Democrats are trying to avoid, 85% Democratic districts, and it doesn't look like that's any easier with the changes in the map now.
Yeah, I agree with you both, Matt and Zach. I think it's, people live where they live, and you're not going to combine people from rural Michigan in a district with people from urban Southeast Michigan just to create more 50-50 districts. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see what they come up with. But I do agree, Zach, I think it's a fallacy to think that Democrats are naturally advantaged because of a redistricting commission. So Darci, you had mentioned the encounter you had with an African-American voter who noted that he didn't vote for president. Do we have any other, do we have actual numbers to show, was there a drop-off between that and down ballot? Did people come out and did they skip the presidential race but vote down the ballot? Did they vote in the James Peters race? Anything that we've seen in that area?
Sorry, I was muted. I said I would defer probably to the data folks. I don't know that I know the answer to. So.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting. One other question we had was, do we think that the ticket splitting occurred right away, like with the James Peters race? If the Democrats had had a better candidate or a more enigmatic candidate than Gary Peters, popular candidate, would they have been saved down the ballot as well? Or was this simply a case of, I love my own local representative and congressional person, but I can't stand the president?
Just quickly on Peters and James, I think that there's some work that Peters has to do in terms of engaging parts of his base. There were concerns that they hadn't heard from him enough, seen him enough prior to this election. So I think that was a factor. And I do think that, for some who are not sort of in the know about James, if you're strong Democrat, that he had some appeal as an African-American for the ticket. But one mistake that I think he made, he did a pretty compelling ad using his grandmother, but it came out like in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign. I think that would have been more impactful if it had come out at the same time that absentee ballots had come out. So, obviously a ton of money, as you mentioned before. But yeah, I think some of it had to do with Peters' visibility or lack thereof prior to running for re-election.
Thank you, Darci. Steve, you noted your expectation that Donald Trump will run again in 4 years. Do you expect that to be as a Republican candidate, or will he take the time now to form a third party?
No, I think he'll run as a Republican. Whether or not he'll win, I don't know. Somebody said that in the question that I said that Trump would win. I only said he would be a candidate. He will run as a Republican. In all the polling I've done over the last 36 years I've been in this business, it's incredible the hold that Donald Trump has on the Republican Party. There has no one been any stronger. If people think that they're going to beat him in a primary, they're smoking something that's now legal in Michigan, and you can get anywhere because Trump has this incredible hold over the party, plus the closeness of this race this time, and the fact that they picked up U.S. House seats. They didn't lose one legislature that they controlled. They picked up 1 or 2. I just think he has a hold over the party that's going to be there for another 4 years, and he'll just start flying around on Trump Force #1 again, campaigning against Biden. As you look forward to 2 years from now, we're all talking about the impact of the reapportionment commission. I think it clearly benefits Democrats. We have a very partisan Secretary of State who was funded by George Soros and others. And so I think that that you're going to see that those lines are not going to be quite as nonpartisan as we think. So I think that's going to be a detriment to Republicans for the next forever, as long as that's in effect. But when you take a look at the potential for voter turnout. I think in 2020, you're going to have a governor who is going to be running for re-election with her party in the White House. This has only occurred once since 1982. And the time that it occurred was in 1990 when John Engler was running for re-election with George H.W. Bush. But unlike most instances when the incumbent president is unpopular at the end of his first 2 years, Bush was running at about a 70% job approval, which allowed Engler to get in. We've never had a situation like this where a governor runs for re-election when her party is in the White House. And so that spells to me a much more difficult race for Gretchen Whitmer had Donald Trump won. Had Trump won, Whitmer's in the flesh. The Republicans perhaps have a chance this time. Now remember, going back to 1948 and Soapy Williams, there has not been one governor who has failed to win a second term except for John Swainson, and he was really running in the 14th year of the Soapy Williams John Swainson era. So, and that goes back to 1962, which is in itself almost 60 years ago.
Matt, any thoughts on Steve's comment about the ensuing election in 2 years? I know that you and I had a conversation the other day to Steve's point that Republicans gained 160 seats in state legislative races across the country. What about in 2 years when we're in a midterm election?
Well, the party that wins the presidential election is immediately favored to lose the next election. Obviously, we had a bit of a split this year where the Republicans gained House seats and state legislative seats, but you still expect the out party to gain. And just to reinforce Steve's point real quick, this is, you know, party performance in Michigan midterm elections. The party out of the presidency has won 18 out of 21 times and gained seats in the legislature most of the time, and the exceptions were very limited losses like Engler, the very close race in 1990 that Steve mentioned. So it's definitely an advantage to be in the party out of power in the midterms.
On that note, I want to thank all of you for your participation here today. Very insightful. Greatly appreciate your perspectives. And to those of you who attended, I hope you've enjoyed this session and gotten something out of it. Look for IPPSR to continue its public policy forums as we move into next year, especially with a new legislature and continuing issues facing the state. Thank you all for joining. Thanks again to the Michigan Political History Society, as well as the Michigan Political Leadership Program and their leadership for helping us put this together. And thank you all to our speakers. Appreciate you being here today.
Thank you.